At its peak, the Roman Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population and commanded the most powerful military force the ancient world had ever seen. Stretching from the windswept hills of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast to the banks of the Euphrates, Rome's legions were unstoppable. But what if I told you that this very strength, this military machine that built an empire, also destroyed it? What if Rome's greatest asset became its most expensive liability? The story of Rome's fall isn't just about barbarian invasions or corrupt emperors. It's about money. It's about a financial system pushed beyond its breaking point by an insatiable appetite for military spending. And the numbers? They're absolutely shocking. To understand how Rome collapsed financially, we need to go back to when things were working. During the late Republic and early Empire, roughly from the 1st century BCE through the 2nd century CE, Rome was a financial powerhouse. The empire's wealth flowed from multiple sources: the fertile grain fields of Egypt, the silver mines of Spain, the olive groves of North Africa, and the tribute paid by conquered peoples across 3 continents. This wasn't just lucky geography, it was systematic extraction backed by military force. Rome's currency system was the backbone of this prosperity. The gold aureus and silver denarius weren't just coins, they were promises. A denarius minted in Rome was trusted in Alexandria, in Londinium, in Jerusalem. Why? Because for over 200 years, the silver content of a denarius barely changed. It contained roughly 90% pure silver. Merchants knew exactly what they were getting. Soldiers knew their pay held real value. This monetary stability allowed Rome to project power across vast distances and maintain complex supply chains that would make modern logistics officers weep with envy. But even during these golden years, Rome faced a fundamental challenge. How do you pay for the world's first professional standing army? At its height, Rome maintained between 300,000 and 450,000 soldiers. That's not counting the navy, the auxiliary forces, or the massive support infrastructure. Every single one of these soldiers expected to be paid, and paid well. A legionary in the 1st century CE earned about 225 denarii per year. Do the math, that's over 100 million denarii annually just in basic salaries, and we haven't even counted food, equipment, fortifications, or veterans' pensions. Here's where Rome's strategy gets interesting. For centuries, war paid for itself. When Trajan conquered Dacia between 101 and 106 CE, the campaign cost an estimated 165 million denarii. Sounds expensive, right? But Dacia's gold mines generated approximately 700 million denarii over the following decades. That's better than a 4-to-1 return on investment. The conquest of Egypt under Augustus brought Rome control of the Mediterranean's breadbasket, generating tax revenue that covered a significant portion of military expenses. War wasn't just policy, it was profitable business. But here's the brutal economic reality that every empire eventually faces. You run out of wealthy neighbors to conquer. By the late 2nd century, Rome's borders had largely stabilized. The empire stretched from ocean to desert, from forest to mountain range. Beyond these borders lay Germania, dense forests filled with fierce tribes who had nothing Rome wanted except the absence of their raids. To the east, Parthia and later Persia were organized empires capable of fighting Rome to a standstill. There were no more Dacias to plunder, no more Egypts to annex. Yet the army didn't shrink. How could it? Every mile of Rome's 10,000-mile frontier needed defending. The Rhine required fortifications. The Danube demanded patrol boats. Hadrian's Wall in Britain needed manning. The Syrian frontier required constant vigilance. The military spending that once generated profit now simply generated expense. Rome was trapped in what economists today would call a cost maintenance trap. You can't reduce spending without losing everything, but you can't increase revenue to match that spending. Let me give you specific numbers that illustrate just how crushing this became. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 CE, spent virtually his entire reign fighting wars along the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes. These weren't wars of conquest, they were defensive struggles just to hold the line. The cost? Estimates suggest these campaigns consumed over 2 billion denarii, nearly bankrupting the imperial treasury. Marcus was forced to auction off palace furniture and imperial jewelry just to pay his soldiers. Think about that. The most powerful man in the world selling his own possessions because the state couldn't afford its military payroll.
His son Commodus inherited not just an empire, but a financial crisis. And this is where we see the first signs of a decision that would ultimately prove fatal. When you can't cut spending and you can't raise enough revenue, there's a third option: change the money itself. Under the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century, military salaries were raised significantly. Septimius Severus famously told his sons to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. But where would this money come from? The answer was currency debasement. Remember that denarius that was 90% silver? By the time of Septimius Severus, around 200 CE, it had dropped to about 50%. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, it was less than 5% silver, basically bronze with a silver wash. The coins looked the same, bore the emperor's face, carried the same official value, but everyone knew they were worthless. This was inflation by imperial decree, a hidden tax on every person holding Roman currency. The effects were catastrophic. Imagine you're a wheat merchant in Antioch. Last year, a modius of wheat cost 2 denarii. This year, it costs 10. Next year, 50. Your costs haven't changed. You're growing the same wheat in the same fields with the same labor, but the money itself has become meaningless. By the late 3rd century, prices had increased by over 2,000%. To put that in perspective, a pound of gold that might have cost 25,000 denarii in 200 CE cost over 2 million denarii by 300 CE. The price didn't change. The money did. Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 CE, tried to fight this inflation by imperial command. His famous price edict of 301 CE set maximum legal prices for over 1,000 goods and services. The penalty for exceeding these prices? Death. It failed spectacularly. You can't legislate away economic reality. Merchants simply stopped bringing goods to market rather than sell at artificial prices. Soldiers rioted when their fixed salaries couldn't buy food. The edict was quietly abandoned. But let's talk about the human cost of this financial collapse, because numbers on spreadsheets don't capture what actually happened to people. Consider a soldier named Gaius, not a real person, but representative of thousands of real soldiers. Gaius enlisted in 250 CE, expecting a stable career. His father had served, earned good money, retired with land and a pension. Gaius received his salary in those debased silver coins. The first year, he could buy new equipment, send money home, save for retirement. 5 years later, his salary is technically the same, but it buys half as much. 10 years in, he's struggling to afford basic necessities. When his commander offers triple pay to support a military coup, can you blame him for saying yes? Loyalty to Rome is an abstract concept. Feeding your family is immediate. This pattern repeated across the empire. Between 235 and 284 CE, just 50 years, Rome had at least 50 different emperors. Most were military commanders who seized power, promised their soldiers higher pay, and were murdered when they couldn't deliver. Each regime change cost money: donatives to secure loyalty, campaigns to crush rivals, reconstruction after civil wars. The army that once protected Rome from external threats was now bleeding it dry through constant internal conflict. Meanwhile, the tax burden on ordinary citizens became unbearable. Provincial governors were given collection quotas that bore no relationship to economic reality. Tax collectors, many of them corrupt officials who bought their positions, squeezed every possible coin from farmers and merchants. The penalty for unpaid taxes? Your land could be confiscated, you could be sold into slavery, your family could be held hostage. Unsurprisingly, people started fleeing. Farmland throughout the empire was abandoned. Why work a field when the tax collector will take everything? Archaeological evidence shows rural depopulation across many provinces during the 3rd and 4th centuries. The empire's tax base was literally walking away. Here's where the death spiral accelerates. Lower agricultural production meant less tax revenue. Less tax revenue meant the government couldn't pay soldiers. Unpaid soldiers became loyal to whoever could pay them, not to Rome. More civil wars meant more destruction of productive capacity. Round and round it went, each turn of the cycle making things worse.
The Western Empire tried everything. Price controls failed. Currency reform failed. Administrative reorganization failed. Constantine created a new gold coin, the solidus, in 312 CE, hoping to restore monetary stability. It worked for the wealthy, but the solidus was too valuable for everyday transactions. Common people still used debased bronze coins for daily commerce, while the elite conducted business in gold, creating a two-tiered economy that increased inequality. By 400 CE, the Roman military was barely Roman anymore. The legions were filled with Germanic mercenaries, often led by Germanic generals fighting other Germanic tribes. These soldiers had no loyalty to Roman institutions. They were contractors, working for pay. When that pay stopped, so did their service. In 410, Alaric and his Visigoths sacked Rome itself, not because they were unstoppable warriors, but because the empire couldn't afford to pay them the subsidies they'd been promised. The final collapse of the Western Empire in 476 wasn't really a collapse, it was more like a foreclosure. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a teenager installed by his military officer father. When Germanic general Odoacer decided he'd rather rule Italy himself, he simply pensioned off the boy emperor and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. There was no great battle, no dramatic last stand. Rome ended not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic memo. But here's what makes this story more than ancient history. The pattern repeats. Look at any major power that has collapsed financially, and you'll see familiar elements. Overextension. Military spending that consumes more resources than the economy can sustainably produce. Currency manipulation to pay for expenses. Inflation destroying middle-class wealth. Growing inequality between elites and common citizens. Political instability as different factions fight over shrinking resources. The Roman Empire at its height generated roughly 250 to 300 million denarii in annual revenue. Military spending alone consumed between 150 and 200 million of that, 60 to 70% of the entire budget. Modern economists generally consider military spending above 5 to 6% of GDP to be economically stressful. Rome was spending something closer to 25 to 30% of its entire economic output on the military during peacetime, and much more during major campaigns. Could Rome have been saved? Theoretically, yes. The Eastern Empire, which we call Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years by making hard choices the West refused to make. They maintained a smaller, more professional army. They protected their currency's value. They reformed taxation to be less economically destructive. They negotiated with enemies instead of always fighting them. Most importantly, they recognized that military power ultimately depends on economic strength, not the other way around. The Western Empire couldn't or wouldn't make those choices. Perhaps the political structure made reform impossible, too many interest groups benefiting from the status quo. Perhaps it was psychological. Romans defined themselves by military conquest, and admitting they could no longer afford their martial identity was unthinkable. Perhaps it was simply too late by the time people realized how serious the problem was. Here's the lesson. Rome didn't fall because barbarians were stronger. Rome fell because it could no longer afford to keep barbarians out. The empire didn't collapse from military defeat. It collapsed from financial exhaustion. Those unstoppable legions, those marble cities, those roads and aqueducts that spanned continents, all of it rested on an economic foundation. When that foundation crumbled under the weight of unsustainable military spending, everything built upon it came crashing down. The numbers were indeed shocking. 90% silver reduced to 5%, prices increasing by 2,000%, 50 emperors in 50 years, an empire that controlled 70 million people brought low not by armies, but by accounting. Rome's greatest strength became its fatal weakness because the empire's leaders confused military power with true strength, never understanding that real power comes from economic stability, sustainable governance, and the ability to adapt when circumstances change. In the end, Rome teaches us that empires don't collapse overnight. They collapse one budget decision at a time, one debased coin at a time, one unpaid soldier at a time. The fall of Rome wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow bleed that no amount of military might could stop, because the problem was never about having enough soldiers. It was about having enough money to pay them. And when that money ran out, so did the empire.